Christmas in January, or Ichigatsu ni wa Christmas, is a really interesting look and study into how people deal with grief and loss and how it affects people around them and how people around them can help them deal with that grief and loss. Christmas in January is a 1991 OVA based off of the manga of the same name by Mariko Iwadate, released in Shueisha's Margaret magazine, the same magazine as works such as Boys Over Flowers. On a side note, I read a lot of books, and Mariko Iwadate is actually a great influence on one of my favourite Japanese authors, Banana Yoshimoto. The studio behind the OVA is Magic Bus Studios, who have been around for a very long time. As recently as 2022, working on the Yokai Watch anime, they worked on some of the Poke-Tunes, which came out recently, and as of late have been making quite a bit of spicy anime, if you catch my drift. Now, my main takeaway from this OVA is that it is a really great and really interesting plot, but the execution of it through the studio may not have been up to the level the plot deserved. And I'm not going to go out there and say they suck for this, because this is an early 90s OVA. I'm not expecting it to be fantastic quality, a fantastic creation, because early 90s OVAs didn't have the most money behind them, and also this was around the time the Japanese economy was about to go pop. So I can't blame them entirely for that. I do think a story like this does deserve maybe a newer, up-to-date, and more expensive rendition. So let's get into the OVA itself. As always, I'm going to be trying to avoid spoilers, so you can go off and watch this yourself, and just give you some of my own analysis and thoughts on the OVA and why you should watch it. Before we start, I do want to mention there are a couple of really sexy mustaches in this. Like early 90s OVA mustaches, love it. Wish I had a thick mustache like that. I do not, unfortunately. Also to note, we start off with casual misogyny. I do think, however, this does play into some of the characters' arcs in the OVA. I feel like in a one-shot manga, this probably would have been looked into further. But for some characters, it is throwaway, and for some characters, it is actually part of their development as a character. So when I initially saw it, I was like, oh no, it's one of those. But then by the end, I was like, okay, I guess it was the 90s, and this is part of a character arc. Christmas in January follows Junsho, a young man who is in his early 20s, working part-time in a shoe shop, and his experience over one Christmas, where he has a fateful encounter with Mizuki. Mizuki is a girl of a similar age to Junsho who seems to be slightly off-putting in her demeanor. She is withdrawn, she sometimes tries to seek attention in ways that you would think aren't common for someone in their early 20s. A little bit more childish than you would perhaps see most characters of that age being. However, as we delve deeper and deeper into the OVA, you start to understand her position and you start to understand why she acts this way. And even though the OVA never completely comes out to justify the way that Mizuki is acting throughout, it does give us reasons why she acts this way. Throughout the OVA, Mizuki is mean, she is short-tempered, but also at times she can be sweet. Also at times she is vulnerable, and Junsho sees this and he tries to wrap his head around it. He tries to wrap his head around Mizuki deciding to stay in a house with no heating by herself in the dark. He tries to go out and help her, and even Junsho's wife, well, fiance in the OVA, goes out of her way to try and help Mizuki. And although Mizuki as a character does at points want to acknowledge their help, at points she does want to acknowledge their kindness, there is something about her that is holding her back. Something that is revealed to us at the end of the OVA. From a character and storytelling perspective, this is done really well in my opinion. Throughout, you are really pushed to dislike Mizuki, and you are pushed to like Junsho. Even though the character of Junsho completely acknowledges that he is not perfect, he completely comes out at parts throughout the OVA as being short, as being curt, as maybe not acting in the best way. But Mizuki also does the same things, but she doesn't acknowledge her flaw in that. She doesn't come out and say, you know what, I was actually wrong for doing that. And I think that is the main difference you've seen between the two of them. So throughout the OVA, you want to be rooting for Junsho, and you kind of want to root for Mizuki, but also whenever she's doing something great, she then does something wrong, or at least what we perceive to be wrong. And I think this is really great storytelling, because throughout it builds and builds and builds this idea that you just can't get on Mizuki's side. And then in the last third of the OVA, you kind of see why she acts this way, and you feel sympathetic. And actually, they sprinkled that throughout the rest of the OVA. They sprinkled that throughout the rest of the story. You got hints as to why Mizuki was acting this way, and then you realize at the end, oh, all the signs were there. All the ideas were there. I just didn't put them together properly to understand why she was acting this way. Christmas in January is a really great portrayal of trauma and grief and how people deal with them, and how the people around those with trauma and grief understand and perceive those people. Because I think we've all met someone who may be going through intense grief, who maybe experience intense trauma, and we don't know how to help them. Perhaps they are like Mizuki, who doesn't actually tell you there is something wrong, so you think they're lashing out for no reason, and you kind of feel annoyed with them. And that's not entirely their own fault. Things like trauma and grief are very difficult to deal with on your own, and they're also very difficult to tell other people about. So then when you understand what they're going through, you actually feel quite sympathetic before them. But it does take that person a really big step to come out and actually discuss their grief, which is really well explored in this OVA, and basically really well explored through the plot. And I keep coming back and saying plot, because Iwadate clearly wrote a very, very great plot to the manga. And I think the plot does do a lot of the heavy lifting here. And plot does include the characters, because the characters are directly lifted from the manga. I think where there are some shortfalls are the runtime. It is a 45-minute runtime. It's actually a case where I think they could have either made it longer to make some of the intense scenes breathe a little bit more, or shortened it to try and be a little bit more snappy and make things hit harder. I think you could have gone either way, and I think it would have improved the product slightly. And like I said at the beginning of this video, I do think this manga, for its story, deserves to have a more expensive and more intricate adaptation. I do think early 90s OVAs have their charms, and those charms do shine through in this adaptation. The music, I think, is very well done. The sound is very well done. The diegetic and non-diegetic sound is very, very good. And I think that is something early 90s OVAs really, really hit hard on and do very well. But I think things like animation, I think like the character design that can maybe be improved. I know the designs in the OVA are very true to the original manga. It is very stylized, but I think that stylization can be brought even more to life, and I think it deserves to be brought to life. And again, I am not bashing Magic Bus. This was an early 90s direct-to-VHS OVA. Of course, it's not going to be the highest production quality. But this OVA isn't just about grief, and it isn't just about trauma. There are other ideas that are addressed in it. And I think, again, it is a really telling example of how strong the plot is, because it also tells the sub-story of Junsho's relationship with his best friend turned fiancée, Seiko. And that's not a spoiler, that happens very early on in the OVA. but it does really tell a very realistic story of best friends falling in love, of how people truly don't reveal their feelings to each other until push comes to shove. It takes Junsho and Seiko having what is meant to be a throwaway conversation actually turning into something more meaningful. I think we've all had those sort of conversations where you make a comment or someone makes a comment and then it just triggers a chain of events within that conversation, which leads to a much bigger conversation being had. And ultimately, it comes to the two of them revealing their true emotions for each other, just from this one throwaway comment that Junsho makes at the beginning of the relationship. And I genuinely think that is such good character writing because it feels so real. And you see that with all of the characters, whether it be our main three characters, Junsho, Mizuki, and Seiko, but also the side characters, Junsho's friends. There's that one friend who is just feels bad for himself throughout, but also is a good laugh throughout. So I think the character writing and the plot is really well executed. And the only thing that holds back this OVA from being more than a 6 or 7 out of 10 is the production quality, which again, you can't fault it because it's an early 90s OVA. Ultimately, I think you should watch this OVA at least once. Frankly, when I started writing my notes for this video as I was watching the OVA, I thought this was going to be a very, very different video. But by the time I got to the very end of this OVA, and I gave myself a day or two to actually think about the story, to actually think about the characters, it turned into what it is now. It turned into be talking about how great the story of this manga is in telling the story of someone dealing with grief and trauma. How natural of a love story is told in this manga, how friends and family are portrayed in this manga. I am glad I took that day to sit back and actually evaluate what this manga is about, because frankly this video is a lot more positive than my early notes for it were. And there are some things that my modern sensibilities don't fully agree with in this manga, like the casual misogyny in it. But that aside, I think it is a really great telling of someone going through extreme grief, extreme trauma, and actually how those of us who are on the outside perceive that person, and how maybe we do need to change how we perceive those around us because we truly don't understand what they are going through in life. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Please go and watch Christmas in January. I think you should watch it at least once. I don't think it needs to be a repeated viewing type manga. I hope you have a really great time over this holiday season. Hope you share it with friends and family, and hopefully you're not working too hard. Take the time and watch anime instead of working hard. You deserve it. It's the end of the year. Thank you for watching. Hit that like and subscribe button if you want to. And hey, maybe this will be your Christmas in January. That didn't make any sense. What am I saying?